Last week, I jumped aboard the Start One, Bench One, Sell One Twitter bandwagon and brought the phenomenon over to YouTube, clearly much to the annoyance of James over on HITC Sport, who wished he'd come up with the idea. The reason this is such a good idea is because it requires very little research. I just ask you all to throw 3 names at me, and then I share my views on them. Happy days. And in a world where I make 7 videos a week, working 12 hours a day Monday to Friday, and usually 4 or 5 hours a day at the weekend, videos that I can put together quickly are a blessing. In my first Start One, Bench One, Sell One video that I made, I picked 7 suggestions out to talk about in depth, and then did some quickfire ones towards the end, and that seemed to work pretty well, so I'm going to follow the same format today. If this video does as well as the first, I see no reason not to make a part 3, so if you'd like to get your suggestions in the future, feel free to follow me on Twitter. The username is simply @HITC Sevens. Ever so quickly, just before I begin, a few weekends ago I followed the advice of my YouTube partner manager and asked you all to subscribe in the introduction rather than at the end of a video. If you look at a graph showing the channel's new subscribers last month, it's pretty mental how big of a difference that one day made. Anyhow, now my boss is taunting me that the Irish guy, with nothing but a second-hand scarf and a raft of insults about Declan Rice, Paul McShane and Jack Grealish, has reached 400,000 subscribers. Meanwhile, Sevens is yet to hit 300,000. So, unless you hate me as much as Paul Smith, a man who seems to have been born with the headstock of a guitar as a head, then please do subscribe to HITC Sevens and help shut my boss up. Okay, I apologise for that diatribe, but without further ado, I'll get started. As with last time, I'm comparing the players based on their talents right now, unless any of them have retired or stated otherwise. Jordi Alba, David Alaba and Marcelo. The 3 best left-backs in world football for the last 7 or 8 years, pretty much since Ashley Cole began to regress, Jordi Alba, David Alaba and Marcelo have all been incredible servants to the game and to their clubs. Marcelo is the pick of the bunch in terms of his entire career to date, I would suggest, although he is the oldest of the 3. Marcelo has made the FIFA Pro World 11 6 times, which is more than twice as many times as any other left back, but as I said, we're only concerned with the here and now, and in the here and now, I think I would be forced to sell the Brazilian. Marcelo is 32 now, and he's had a difficult couple of seasons. Make no mistake, I'm not suggesting that he's over the hill or won't have a brilliant renaissance further into his 30s, but it's always going to be narrow margins when you're dealing with players of this calibre. Right now, despite the fact he spent much of the season at centre-back, I think David Alaba is the best left-back in the world, so I have little choice but to start him. That means my ultimate answer is to start Alaba, bench Alba, and sell Marcelo. I think it's worth noting that since 2012, all 3 of Alaba, Alba and Marcelo have spent periods of time as the best left-backs in the world, and my order probably would have been different 18 months ago and would most likely change again in another 18 months, especially if Alaba becomes a centre-back for good. Christian Benteke, Jermaine Defoe and Yakubu. This is an interesting one which Mal's made quite clear is in regards to the 3 players in their prime, and that's important since I would rank them very differently if we were talking about their overall careers. Christian Benteke may now miss the target more often than the All Lives Matter people miss the point, having scored only 2 goals in 40 games over the last 2 seasons, but we ought not forget who we're talking about in terms of peak Benteke. In his very first season in England, Benteke scored 23 goals for Aston Villa, almost single-handedly keeping the club in the Premier League. His 19 league goals put him 4th in the Premier League scoring charts that season, trailing only Robin van Persie, Luis Suarez and Gareth Bale, at a time when many people considered him to be a superior centre-forward to his compatriot Romelu Lukaku. That may be a distant memory now, but I don't believe Yakubu or Defoe ever had more dominant seasons than Benteke in 2012-13, so I have to start him. Yakubu did bag 17 league goals in 30 Premier League games in a woeful Blackburn Rovers team, and that was where many people felt his best years were behind him, and I think his record in the Premier League is an often underrated one. I'd have to bench prime Yakubu and sell prime Jermaine Defoe, and I can already feel some of you seething through your phones, tablets and laptop screens. If I were ranking these 3 on their careers overall, you could reverse the order. I'd be starting Defoe, benching Yakubu, and selling Benteke. On talent, I'd be starting Yakubu, benching Defoe, and still selling Benteke, but in their prime, based on their best seasons, which was the question, I have to start Benteke, bench Yakubu, and sell Defoe. Neil Franklin, Bobby Moore, and Franz Beckenbauer. There were a few more historic ones which I'd love to do, but largely refrained due to the barrage of abuse I'd get in the comments and through fear that I'd send some viewers to sleep, but I have included one. Presumably well in the knowledge that I have written a critically acclaimed biography of Neil Franklin, officially approved by Neil's family, unlike a new book about Franklin which coincidentally is apparently coming out this year. Ahmed asks who I would start, bench and sell between 3 of the finest defenders to have ever lived. Of course, since Franklin and Moore are sadly no longer with us, and Franz Beckenbauer is age 74, I'm comparing these 3 legends of the game in their prime. I'll start with Franz Beckenbauer, who is the player I would have to start. Nicknamed Der Kaiser, or the Emperor, Beckenbauer is the greatest defender to have ever lived. An impeccable reader of the game, as brave as a lion, and better on the ball and in the pass than almost any contemporary attacking midfielder, Beckenbauer is a man without peer, and he'd be the first name on my team sheet. Across their whole careers, there's no doubt Bobby Moore achieved more than Neil Franklin, due to the combination of his '66 World Cup win and Franklin's ill-fated trip to Bogota. I'm comparing the 2 players at their peaks though, and for that reason, I have to bench Franklin and sell Moore. Bobby Moore is a giant of the game and one of the greatest centre-backs to have ever lived, but he wasn't entirely without flaw. He wasn't the strongest, nor was he the most dominant in the air. Franklin, at his best, was a man without weakness, and the best centre-half in Europe, so I'm starting Franz, benching Neil, and regretfully selling Bobby. Eric Dier, Declan Rice, and KALVIN Phillips. I think this is a slightly unfair one, since KALVIN Phillips is as yet untested at any level other than the Championship. Meanwhile, Declan Rice and Eric Dier are both full England internationals. Nevertheless, I played the room as it's dealt, and I'd hate for anyone to think I was shirking a challenge. Of the 3, I'm starting Declan Rice, who is the youngest of the 3 by some distance. An excellent athlete and reader of the game, people may have got a tad overexcited about Rice last season, as they often tend to with young English players, but he is some talent. I think it would take a really awful injury or some freak occurrence to prevent Rice from playing Premier League football for the next decade, whether it is at West Ham or elsewhere, and I'd be surprised if he didn't win more England caps than either of the other 2 over the next 10 years. Even though KALVIN Phillips is as yet unproven, he has been excellent for Leeds, especially since Marcelo Bielsa's arrival, and if I were a Leeds United fan, I wouldn't swap him for Eric Dier. Perhaps Phillips will be found out, so to speak, in the Premier League, but right now, I'm starting Rice, benching Phillips, and selling Dier. Rio Ferdinand, John Terry, and Vincent Kompany. Many people will disagree with my decision here, but I can't say I have too many doubts about it. Ask almost any Premier League player or England international from the mid-90s up until 2010 to pick their best England or Premier League 11, and they will pick Rio Ferdinand. The partners will change from Terry to Vidic, Kompany or Adams, but Rio is invariably unchanged. That is because the Manchester United legend was the complete centre-back. Strong, athletic, intelligent, and a Rolls Royce both in possession and in passing the ball. Rio Ferdinand could play in any team in any era and play masterfully, especially in his prime, so he starts. Vincent Kompany is obviously a Premier League legend, and even well into his 30s, we have seen the difference his departure, to him with the injury to Aymeric Laporte, has made at Manchester City this season. Nonetheless, I'm benching John Terry and selling the former Man City captain without any real doubt in my mind. Even when he first broke through at Chelsea as a teenager, John Terry had a sixth sense for sniffing out danger, the type that seems almost impossible to coach. A first-class reader of the game, a born leader, and a terrific all-round centre-back. Put simply, I think John Terry was a better centre-back than Vincent Kompany. So I'm starting Rio, benching JT, and selling Vincent, so long as he can pass a medical somewhere else, given that he's most likely sidelined with a muscle injury. Ronaldo, Ronaldinho, and Rivaldo. Again, I think this one is supposed to be a real killer, but I think it's a pretty easy call. Ronaldo Luis Nazario de Lima is perhaps the third greatest footballer of my lifetime, trading the 2 obvious candidates, and he would be talked about in the same breath as Messi, Ronaldo, Pele and Maradona, were it not for his torturous injury problems that arrived so early on in his career. A young Ronaldo at PSV, Barcelona and Inter Milan was one of the most terrifying sights you're ever likely to see on a football pitch, almost like football's equivalent to a young Mike Tyson. Even after being sidelined for a year and losing some of that searing pace, Ronaldo was still the best player in the world, as he proved at the 2002 World Cup, so he starts without a shadow of a doubt. It is a closer call between Ronaldinho and Rivaldo, but still one that won't give me any sleepless nights. Both players, I believe, could have achieved more, primarily in terms of longevity, but Ronaldinho was for a brief period the most entertaining footballer of the last 2 decades at least. One of the finest manipulators of the ball I've ever seen, Ronaldinho would pull off tricks in Champions League and World Cup knockout games that most players wouldn't even dare to attempt in training. Don't get me wrong, Rivaldo was a monster. Big, strong, brilliant on the ball, and equally capable of winning a game via an incisive pass or a thunderous long-range effort, but I have no option but to sell him. Ronaldo starts, Ronaldinho is benched, and Rivaldo walks, for the purposes of this video, but in real life I'd be starting all three and getting the band back together. John Stones, Phil Jones, and DEJAN Lovren. We go from three of the greatest centre-forwards of the modern era to three of the finest defenders. I'm just kidding, of course. Watching John Stones, Phil Jones and DEJAN Lovren trying to contain Ronaldo, Rivaldo and Ronaldinho at their peak would be a little like watching the United Kingdom trying to contain a pandemic. Absolute mayhem with catastrophic consequences. Anyhow, if you ask DEJAN Lovren, he has to start, since he is obviously one of the best defenders in the world. Unfortunately, you're not asking DEJAN Lovren, you're asking me, and I'm not quite so confident in his abilities. All joking aside, these three obviously aren't that bad, given the fact they all play for huge football clubs. I long felt that Phil Jones would one day cut out the mistakes in his game and become a really good centre-back, since he is certainly talented, but at the age of 28, that should have happened by now. John Stones is threatening to go down a similar path, quite clearly a talent, but still not fully trusted by Pep Guardiola. DEJAN Lovren can sometimes look the most capable of the three, but only with Virgil van Dijk by his side. Ultimately, I think John Stones is the pick of the bunch right now, and if I was picking a team, he'd be the one I'd start. DEJAN Lovren would be benched, and inevitably, Phil Jones would have to be sold. Right, I've harped on for a little longer than last time, so I won't bore you with too many quickfire ones. I'll just pick out 3 to round the video up to 10. I must admit, there were far more responses to the tweet than I anticipated, enough for me to probably make about 35 parts to this video. So thanks to everyone who sent in a suggestion, and you have my sincere apologies that I'm unable to cover them all. I'll end with 3 interesting centre-forward dilemmas, starting with arguably the 3 greatest African footballers of all time, Samuel Eto'o, George Weah, and Didier Drogba. At their peaks, I'm starting Drogba, benching Weah, and selling Eto'o. Across their entire careers, I'm starting Eto'o, benching Weah, and selling Drogba. I'd love to go into more detail, but this is the quickfire round. Next up are 3 Dutch greats, Marco van Basten, Patrick Kluivert, and RUUD van Nistelrooy. I think it's a very easy decision to start Marco van Basten, who was almost the perfect centre-forward, and I'd be benching RUUD and selling Kluivert. Last but not least, a current one, we have Jamie Vardy, Ciro Immobile, and Kylian Mbappe. Mbappe starts, of course, and it's a tough one between Vardy and Immobile. Personally, I don't think Ciro Immobile would score as many goals as Jamie Vardy in the Premier League, but nor do I believe Jamie Vardy would score as many goals as Ciro Immobile in Serie A. Long story short, Mbappe starts, Immobile is benched, and Vardy is heading to a party that isn't in my squad. That is your lot. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Give us a like if you enjoyed the video, and as ever, feel free to subscribe to HITC Sevens, which is almost unanimously considered to be the best East Yorkshire-based football YouTube channel run by someone called Alfie.